Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 1 lecture, where we're going to talk about the history of the juvenile justice system. So let's jump in with our learning objectives. We will retrace the journey of juvenile justice in the United States. We will summarize the history of juvenile confinement, summarize the historical themes that guided the development of juvenile justice in the United States, describe the function of the juvenile justice system, describe how juvenile offenders are processed, and examine the various philosophies and strategies in correcting juveniles. So let's start with the roots of juvenile justice. Juvenile justice really started in early Europe, where responsibility was determined by four factors: severity of the crime, juveniles' maturity, their capacity to distinguish between right and wrong, and evidence of just blatant malice. So what they would usually do with juveniles in early Europe was use them in such a way of, they would assign a juvenile to sort of like an apprenticeship in a craft or a trade. So they would send them to live with a wealthier family where they would have full control over that child. So this is sort of the idea where parens patriae comes from. This is where the focus is on the sovereign who protects their subjects, and it was just the basis for the entire creation of the juvenile justice system. In these times, there were also between 160 and 200 capital offenses that children could actually be executed for. And there were about 18 to 20 people executed in London in 1785 who were under the age of 18. Now, obviously, knowing what we know about juvenile development, brain development, and just behavioral development over the years, and how it's not developed by the age of 18, sometimes not even until you're 25, we know now that that is completely ridiculous. So when we talk about how the colonies, juvenile justice was really shaped by the cultural and religious ideas of the Puritans. So the family was the primary means of social control, and they allowed whippings, dunkings, the stocks, expulsion from the community, and again, even up to and including capital punishment. Really, there was an increased urbanization and industrialization in the 1800s, which led reformers to start creating sort of asylums and training schools to help maintain that control and order of these juveniles who were really sort of out of control. So parens patriae was formalized by Ex parte Kraus in 1838, which actually gave the court a legal basis to now start intervening in the lives of these children. So they could confine minors without criminal behavior, and unfortunately, these juveniles were not given the right to counsel or trial by jury. So they didn't have a lot of those legal protections that they have now. Now, the juvenile court developed out of a lot of the first juvenile court developed out of a lot of poor conditions that were seen in Cook County jails and the Chicago House of Corrections, where children were being housed with adults. In this case, the judge, the child, the parent, and the probation officer would sit and just discuss the case. Complaints could be brought by not just the police, but school officials, parents, citizens, or just other people in the community. Now, these hearings were confidential, and all of the records were confidential. But proof of criminality was not needed for court services, so juveniles were able to get the help of the court, but they weren't necessarily having to prove that the juvenile was in fact guilty of that crime. So the court was really being given wide discretion in determining which services and disposition a juvenile would receive, and lawyers weren't part of that process. I didn't mention them earlier. It was just the judge, parent, child, and probation officer. So standards and procedures that were being used in adult court were not now being used in these juvenile courts. So they didn't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and hearsay was admitted. So we start off with having these classical schools of criminology or thoughts versus the positivist school of thought. So the classical school, those who ascribed to this, said that people chose to willfully violate laws, that people had total control over their actions, and punishment was necessary in order to correct behavior. Whereas the positivist school said that People were really pushed into crime by forces beyond their control, whether that be environmental, political, economic, social, biological, psychological, all these other factors culminated to sort of push this person into crime. So the thought here was that sort of once a cause was identified, that then experts could cure the individual if they could figure out what it was that was causing them to engage in crime, or in the case of juveniles, delinquency. So what do our juvenile courts look like today? Our juvenile courts handle 3 different types of offenders. You have delinquency offenders, you have individuals who are dependent, and you have those who are neglected. So delinquency are juveniles who commit either acts that are considered a misdemeanor or felony offense if it was committed by an adult. And status offenses are any behavior where it's only an offense because the person is a juvenile because they're under the age of 18. So things like drinking alcohol, running away from home, truancy, not going to school, or just being ungovernable. Those would fall under status offenses. So an adult could not be charged for those. Then you have dependency. So these are juveniles who are just uncontrollable at home with the family. So they now become dependent on the state. Then you have juveniles who are neglected. These are those individuals where their basic needs are either not being met, food, shelter, care, health care, or they're being abused by their caretaker. So the juvenile court handles all 3 of these different types of youth. So moving into the history of juveniles being confined, really the American Revolution, during this time, jails and prison conditions were just honestly deplorable. Juveniles were being confined with adults. You had men and women together. You had sane and insane. You had felons, misdemeanants. Everybody was just put into the same places. Nobody was separated. Youth were being given really severe punishments. They could be hanged, mutilated, banished. They could be placed on extended whaling voyages, even being placed with other relatives on a farm, giving them fines or beatings. So again, we're really seeing juveniles being treated just the same as adults are. They also had fixed sentences, and the local enforcers of all of the juvenile confinement were considered these watchmen or magistrates or sheriffs. That's who was trying to make sure that juveniles were following all of the rules that they should. So we had 3 different types of confinement that then started for juveniles. We have the house of refuge, reformatory or training schools, and the cottage system. So just briefly, when we talk about the house of refuge, these started in New York City in 1825, where we had the first school for males. This was for youth who were both poor, destitute, incorrigible, or orphaned. Incorrigible, they just essentially could not be encouraged to follow the law. They couldn't be encouraged to do what they were supposed to be doing. So think of sort of your dependent youth. They just didn't want to listen. Youth would typically be there for 6 months to a year. They would have institutional clothing, be given identical haircuts, and taught trades. This is where we started to see indeterminate sentencing for juveniles. So they could be there just as long as it took for them to essentially learn the trade and start to learn to follow the rules. But they would be given severe disciplines of being maybe placed on a diet of just bread and water, or even deprived of meals as a form of discipline. And as a form of more severe discipline, they could even be placed in solitary confinement or face corporal punishment. We then move into our reformatory or training schools, where this was a sort of like longer schooling type of structure where youth were placed outside of the cities, hoping that by exposing them to some rural virtues and the simple life, that Mother Nature and being placed on the farm would just be reforming enough for them. So by 1847, Massachusetts opened its first state-operated training school, the Lyman School for Boys. And in 1856, they established a state industrial school for girls in Lancaster. And nearly every state outside of the South then had one established by 1890. They were a little bit more fortress-like. Was exploitive because they were contracting these youth for labor purposes. essentially saying that they were reforming the youth and giving them training, but really it just turned into inmate labor. And then we move into the cottage system. So looking into the cottage system, they followed this family model where the institution was viewed as sort of the home. The peers within the cottage would be their family, and then the staff would act as parents, what we know, or we call today sort of as house parents for some of our group homes. They would be in the forms of log cabins, maybe brick or stone, and you would have about 20 to 40 juveniles in each cabin or each cottage that would then take on this sort of family model. So we're really starting to see a transformation of how juveniles are being confined and what we're focusing on with them in these schools. We then come into the development of probation. So we have John Augustus, who is considered the father of probation. Now, he believed that lawbreakers only needed a concerned person to be able to stop their drinking and straighten out their lives for themselves. So he worked with all types of offenders, thieves, felons, drunks, prostitutes. He would do a lot of what we actually see today in probation, where he would investigate the individual and do a whole background on them. He would interview them, supervise them, arrange for different services and employment or education. And he would even actually bail people out of jail with his own money as long as they promised him that they would show up to the next hearing. So we started then in 1869 this idea of visiting probation agent system in Massachusetts. It was for youth and adults, and it was for those who showed promise that they could be released on probation and that they could be successful. We then had our first paid probation officer on a police force in Boston, Massachusetts in 1878. And this extended to all cities and towns in Massachusetts in 1880. Probation was then statewide just 10 years later, and courts then had the authority to appoint probation officers rather than the municipalities. And then other states soon followed within the same pattern. So probation officers would gather the relevant facts about the juvenile and give an opinion on the case to the judge so the judge could make appropriate decisions. And in 1907, we had the National Association of Probation Officers formed, that was renamed the National Probation Association in 1911. This was by Homer Folks, who was an early advocate of probation. And he said that probation really provides a new kind of reformatory without walls and without much coercion. And that still rings true today for what probation looks like. Now, aftercare is really this idea of parole, where after a juvenile is placed is either at that time an indentured servant or an apprentice, they would be released once that service was complete and placed back with the families. So individuals were able to get cheap labor on their farms. And by the early 1900s, we had these professionally trained aftercare workers, or parole officers essentially, that would help these juveniles who are now being released to reintegrate back into their homes and into society. Looking at some of the historical themes that we've seen across juvenile justice, we have a couple. First, we start out with discovering the child, which really in early societies, children took on whatever role was necessary to help the families, and they were held responsible just like adults were. But reformers really started questioning the age of responsibility here, discovering what a child actually is. We then saw this era of increasing authority of the state, where authority was really being gradually taken away from the families to handle these juveniles, and it was being given to the state. So during this time, we saw high rates of divorce and a lot of more single-parent families coming out. There was more abuse and neglect and even drug and alcohol use among parents and youth and adolescents. And then you had a rise in out-of-wedlock births. So we saw all this during the time of this increasing authority of the state taking over. We then have reform and retrenchment. So reform is when treatment of offenders is seen as too lenient, and retrenchment is the reduction of costs or spending in response to economic difficulty. So in the 1960s to 1970s was really a liberal agenda, and it was used to reduce the use of training schools and use diversion for status and minor offenders to really reform the juvenile justice system. So Reagan administration's crime control policy really involved preventing detention and transferring your violent repeat offenders to adult court. We saw mandatory and permanent sentences of serious and repeat offenders. We saw increased long-term confinement, and we even saw the death penalty for those who committed brutal and senseless murders. Again, remember that these are juveniles. So at this point, we were still sentencing juveniles to death for certain murder offenses. In the 1980s, we saw this get tough approach, which really involved increasing restrictions and sanctions on juveniles. So early 1990s, we saw establishing curfews, passing parental responsibility laws. So, for instance, if a juvenile is not going to school or truancy, the parent actually gets in trouble for that as well. We saw an increase in efforts to combat street gangs, moving toward graduated sanctions, creating juvenile boot camps, even maintaining and strengthening the current laws, restricting juveniles' use of guns, opening juvenile proceedings and records to the public, and transferring juveniles to criminal or adult court, which was the only place that they could actually be sentenced to death or given an adult sentence. And then expanding the authority, the sentencing authority that the courts had over juveniles. So as we have this get tough approach, we then have this go slow. So in the early 2000s, we really saw a reduction in the use of incarceration and improved conditions in juvenile facilities. We expanded some community-based options using least restrictive measures. So using all of our available resources before placing a juvenile, trying to keep them into the community as much as possible, and keeping those status offenders out of the juvenile justice system. Remember, our status offenders are juveniles who can only be considered, individuals who can only be considered an offender because they are a juvenile. So juveniles who commit serious crimes or continue to break the law were then to be presumed to deserve punishment rather than treatment because these juveniles possessed free will and essentially they knew what they were doing. We also have two other ideas where it was the threat of dangerous poor, where we saw some class favoritism, where poor children were being processed through the system more than middle class, and we criminalized behaviors that poor children tended to engage in more than those who were affluent. And then there's just this idea of the unsolvable nature of youth crime, so that there really is no simple solution to solving juvenile crime. Every generation of reformers attempts and just hopefully learns from the last generation that came through, and we're always just doing our best with what we know at the time. We have a few different agencies involved in juvenile justice. So you have the police, the courts, and corrections departments. Obviously, the goal of police is to enforce the law and maintain order, so they may settle family disputes, make arrests, they can even deter crime, which we'll see, and they collect evidence. The courts are responsible for disposing of the case, so determining what the best decision is for that juvenile. For cases who are referred by intake in juvenile probation, the courts deal again with neglect cases, dependency, and delinquency cases. And then our corrections departments are really our juvenile probation officers, our Department of Youth Services. We have our day treatment and residential programs who have a job of preparing youth for returning back to the community. You have training schools where they decide when the youth is ready for release and ensure that they receive all of their constitutionally guaranteed due process. And we also have aftercare officers that fall within this, where they supervise individuals who are released from training schools and just ensure that they're complying with those aftercare agreements. Now, I don't want to get bogged down too much with this graphic, but it is just somewhat of a simpler way to look at what does a case look like as it's going through the system. So there's a few different ways you can have referral sources. Again, they can come from law enforcement, or referral sources can be from schools, for example. If they aren't diverted from the system, then you start moving along on this continuum to prosecution, and you have a few options from there. Again, I don't want to get bogged down too much with this until we maybe get closer to the end of the semester where these pieces are going to start to fall into place, but we'll talk about transferring youth to the adult court. And you see here up at the top, there's a few different ways that this can happen, and then the youth ends up in the criminal justice system. Again, also along that process, as they get through prosecution, going through the juvenile court intake department where they're going to decide, do we handle this informally or formally? At all of these places, a juvenile could go into detention, which would be the juvenile justice system. And then finally, as they come out and a juvenile is adjudicated and either placed on probation or placed in a residential placement, you have all of these different options that can occur where a juvenile could be in a residential placement. They could fail out of that placement. They could come back in and we could have to replace them. They could come back out on aftercare and reoffend, and then we go through a revocation and we place them back into a residential placement. So this is sort of a fluid process once you get after adjudication, where a juvenile can move in and out of these different options here. And lastly, we're just going to talk about a few correctional models to justice and juvenile justice, where we have correctional models of rehabilitation, justice, crime control, and barge, which barge is what we use now in the juvenile justice system. It's the framework that we operate off of. We also use rehabilitation within that framework. So rehabilitation is really this idea of parens patriae, where we're finding the root of the problem and we're treating it. So there's a focus on treatment, on mental health, physical and social needs. The justice approach is really just desserts, that the severity of the punishment should match the severity of the crime. And the idea in here is also to decriminalize status offenders using proportionate sentencing and having training schools that are more humane and safer. When we talk about crime control, the first priority of justice is protecting life and property of innocent individuals by isolating individuals or offenders when we need to. So using severe and certain punishments, this idea that lawbreakers are actually abnormal and it's not the norm, and that unlawful behavior is really this character deficit that can be corrected through punishment alone. So crime control really contrasts to rehabilitation. And then balanced and restorative justice, which is the graphic to the right here, really is to take into account, and it's this idea of restorative justice, taking into account the victim, the community, and the individual. So having the offender be accountable to the victims and increasing their competency while also enhancing community safety. So the restorative process brings all of the individuals and parties who are affected together so they can discuss how the victim can be made whole, how the community can be safe, and then how we're going to help the individual to not engage in the same behavior again. So in this case, the juvenile offender is going to be, we're viewing them as crime being viewed as a symptom of family breakdown, community disorganization, and conflict within the community. So while juveniles do have free will, and to some degree they know what they're engaging in and they know that it's wrong and they deserve to be punished, that punishment really needs to come along with rehabilitation, programming, competency development. So we don't really use the term punishment in the juvenile world. We use accountability, because it really is just holding them accountable for what they've engaged in. So in sum, our early societies really punished youth as adults, up to and including corporal punishment. The family was viewed as the main source of social control until this parens patriae ideal came in, and it gave the courts a legal basis to now intervene in these juveniles' lives. Juvenile confinement began with the House of Refuge in the early 19th century and was followed by the reformatory or training schools and then the cottage system, which again we still use today. Our historical themes that really guided the development of the juvenile justice system included all 6 of these: discovering the child, increasing authority of the state, reform and retrenchment, the get tough to go soft approach, threat of dangerous poor, and then the unsolvable nature of youth and juvenile crime. There are 3 main juvenile justice agencies that are involved in the system, including the police, the courts, and corrections departments. And then there's 4 main correctional models, including the treatment model, justice model, crime control model, and balanced and restorative justice models. So that was your Chapter 1 lecture. I hope everyone has a fabulous week.